The ceramic mug hit the counter with a soft clink, steam rising from the freshly poured Colombian dark roast. Sarah Bennett moved with practiced efficiency behind the counter of Moonbeam Coffee, her auburn hair tied back in a simple ponytail, a small silver cross catching the morning light at her throat. To anyone watching, she was just another barista in downtown Seattle, someone who knew the difference between a cortado and a Gibraltar, who could work the espresso machine blindfolded. After 3 years of muscle memory. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But when Lieutenant Commander Jake Harrison walked through the door that Tuesday morning, everything changed. The man who had led classified operations across 3 continents froze mid-step, his trained ears catching something impossible. A voice he hadn't heard in 4 years. A voice that had saved his life in the Syrian desert. The voice belonged to a ghost. Sarah Bennett had always been particular about her morning routine. Wake at 5:30 a.m., 20 minutes of meditation facing east toward the rising sun, then a short walk through Pioneer Square to open Moonbeam Coffee by 6:15. She unlocked the glass door with the same brass key she'd used for 3 years, flipping the hand-painted sign from closed to open before switching on the vintage Edison bulbs that cast warm pools of light across the reclaimed wood tables. The coffee shop occupied the ground floor of a converted 1920s warehouse. Its exposed brick walls decorated with local artwork and the kind of carefully curated vintage furniture that made tech workers feel authentically urban. Sarah had fallen in love with the space the moment she'd seen it, drawn by the tall windows that let in the gray Seattle light and the sense of sanctuary it provided from the world outside. She moved through the opening routine with meditative precision, grinding beans and calibrating the espresso machine while NPR's Morning Edition played softly from speakers hidden among the hanging plants. The work was honest and uncomplicated, requiring nothing more than attention to detail and genuine care for the customers who depended on her to fuel their days. After years of complexity and moral ambiguity, Sarah had found peace in the simple transaction of providing comfort 1 cup at a time. The first customers began arriving at 6:45. The usual parade of Microsoft engineers and Amazon executives who valued consistency above conversation. Sarah knew their orders by heart. Marcus wanted a double-shot cortado with oat milk, no sugar. Jennifer always ordered a large Pike Place roast with room for cream, though she never actually added any. David invariably asked for whatever seasonal drink was featured on the chalkboard menu, even if he'd ordered the same thing for weeks running. These people had become the architecture of her new life, reliable and predictable in ways that made her feel grounded. They knew her as Sarah the barista, someone who remembered their names and asked about their weekend plans with genuine interest. They had no idea that the woman steaming their milk had once coordinated supply drops for Kurdish fighters behind enemy lines, or that her fluent Arabic had helped evacuate American civilians from Damascus during the early days of the Civil War. Sarah had buried that version of herself so completely that sometimes she almost forgot she had ever existed. The State Department credentials were locked in a safe deposit box across town, along with commendation letters from generals whose names appeared in classified briefings and a Purple Heart she'd never worn. The shoulder wound that had ended her diplomatic career had healed to a thin white scar, barely visible beneath the strap of her apron. She had chosen Seattle specifically because it felt as far from the Middle East as geography would allow. A city where the biggest international crisis was deciding between Ethiopian or Guatemalan single-origin beans. The rain suited her temperament, washing the streets clean every morning and muffling the sharp edges of memory that sometimes surfaced without warning. Here, she could disappear into the rhythm of ordinary life, finding purpose in small acts of service that didn't require security, clearances, or moral compromises. The coffee shop itself had been her salvation. When the owner, Mrs. Chun, had decided to retire and return to Taiwan, Sarah had used her government pension and savings to buy the business outright. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest work. And after years of navigating the gray areas between official policy and human necessity, honesty felt like a luxury she could finally afford. She had kept Mrs. Chun's staff initially, but they had gradually moved on to other opportunities, leaving Sarah to run the shop mostly alone, except for Jessica Park, a University of Washington graduate student who worked afternoons and weekends. Jessica was studying international relations, full of idealistic energy about making the world a better place through diplomacy and cultural understanding. Sarah listened to her theories about conflict resolution and multilateral cooperation with the patient smile of someone who had seen how those ideals translated into practice. But she never discouraged the younger woman's optimism. The morning crowd began to thin around 9 a.m., leaving Sarah with the handful of freelancers and remote workers who treated the coffee shop as their office, nursing single drinks for hours while typing on laptops and conducting video calls in the corner booths. She used the lull to restock supplies and prep for the lunch rush, falling into the familiar meditation of physical labor. At 9:47 a.m., the brass bell above the door chimed to announce a new customer. Sarah looked up from the espresso machine she was cleaning, ready to offer her standard greeting, when she found herself looking into a face she hadn't seen in 4 years. The man was older than she remembered, his brown hair now streaked with premature gray, lines around his eyes that spoke of long nights and difficult decisions. But the bearing was unmistakable, the way he carried himself with the casual confidence of someone accustomed to command. Lieutenant Commander Jake Harrison had aged well, his civilian clothes dark jeans and a black wool sweater unable to disguise the military posture that had been drilled into him through 2 decades of service. He moved like a predator, economical and alert, his eyes automatically cataloging exits and potential threats, even in the benign environment of a Seattle coffee shop. Sarah recognized the habits because she shared them, though she had worked hard to suppress the hypervigilance that had once kept her alive in more dangerous places. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Harrison stood frozen just inside the door, his expression cycling through confusion, recognition, and something that might have been disbelief. Sarah felt her own carefully constructed composure crack, muscle memory from another life asserting itself as her hand moved instinctively toward where she had once carried a sidearm. "Can I help you?" she heard herself say, falling back on the script of customer service, even as her mind raced through implications and possibilities. Her voice was steady, professional, giving no hint of the recognition that had sent adrenaline flooding through her system. Harrison approached the counter slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, almost conversational. But Sarah caught the undertone of command that had once coordinated complex operations across hostile territory. "Medium coffee, black," he said, never taking his eyes off her face. "And maybe you could tell me if they've started serving ghosts in Seattle." Sarah turned toward the coffee urns, using the moment to regain her composure. Her hands moved automatically through the familiar motions of filling a cup and snapping on a lid. But her mind was calculating distances to exits, assessing whether any of the other customers might be associated with Harrison's presence. After 4 years of careful anonymity, she had almost convinced herself that the past would stay buried. "That'll be $3.50, she said, setting the cup on the counter between them. "And I'm afraid we only serve coffee and pastries. Nothing supernatural on the menu." Harrison placed a $5 bill on the counter, his fingers brushing hers as she made change. The contact was brief but intentional, and Sarah felt the slight pressure of something being passed between them. When she looked down, she saw a business card tucked beneath the money, plain white stock with only a phone number printed in simple black font. "Keep the change," Harrison said, picking up his coffee. "And Sarah, it's good to see you alive." He was gone before she could respond, the door closing behind him with the same soft chime that had announced his arrival. Sarah stood motionless, behind the counter, staring at the business card while her carefully ordered world shifted around her like sand. The other customers continued their conversations, typing on their laptops and sipping their drinks, oblivious to the fact that someone's past had just walked through the door and shattered the illusion of safety that had taken years to construct. Slipped the card into her apron pocket, finishing Harrison's transaction with mechanical precision. But her mind was no longer in the coffee shop. It was in a bombed-out building in Aleppo, where she had spent 3 days coordinating the evacuation of American journalists, while mortar fell like rain. It was in the safe house in Damascus where she had decoded intelligence intercepts while Syrian forces closed in around the diplomatic compound. It was in the desert outside Raqqa, where she had used a broken radio to guide a rescue team to a downed helicopter carrying Navy SEALs who had been conducting classified operations against ISIS. The voice Harrison had recognized belonged to that version of herself, the one who had earned the call sign Nightingale for her ability to communicate across impossible distances with damaged equipment and desperate precision. That woman had saved lives and changed the course of battles through nothing more than her voice and her refusal to abandon people in need. She had also made enemies who would kill her without hesitation if they ever learned she was still alive. Sarah looked around the coffee shop, taking inventory of the life she had built cup by cup over the past 3 years. The regular customers who trusted her to fuel their days. Jessica, who looked up to her as a mentor and role model. Mrs. Patterson from next door, who sometimes brought her homemade cookies and treated her like the daughter she'd never had. All of it felt suddenly fragile, as if Harrison's recognition had exposed it as an elaborate stage set that could be struck and removed at any moment. But even as fear crept through her carefully maintained calm, Sarah felt something else stirring in her chest, something that had been dormant for so long. She had almost forgotten its weight and texture. It was the pull of purpose that transcended personal safety, the recognition that some things mattered more than the comfortable anonymity she had constructed around herself. The business card felt like a live wire in her pocket, carrying current from a world she had tried to leave behind. She knew that whatever Harrison wanted, it wouldn't be simple or safe. Men like him didn't surface in civilian coffee shops to exchange pleasantries about the weather. They came bearing missions that required the specific skills of people who had already proven their willingness to sacrifice everything for something larger than themselves. Sarah Bennett, the barista, wanted to throw the card away and pretend the encounter had never happened. But Nightingale, the communications specialist, was already calculating frequencies and encryption protocols, already remembering the weight of responsibility that came with being the voice in the darkness that guided people home. The morning rush was over, but the day was just beginning. And somewhere in the back of her mind, Sarah could hear the faint crackle of radio static, calling her back to a war that had never really ended. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The phone rang at 2:47 a.m., cutting through the silence of Sarah's Capitol Hill apartment. Like a blade. She was already awake, had been staring at the ceiling for hours while rain drummed against the windows, and her mind cycled through possibilities she didn't want to consider. The business card lay on her nightstand, innocuous white paper that had somehow managed to unravel 3 years of carefully constructed peace. She let it ring 4 times before answering, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "Bennett, we need to meet." Harrison's voice was different now, stripped of the casual politeness he had maintained in the coffee shop. This was the tone she remembered from Syria, clipped and urgent, carrying the weight of decisions that couldn't wait for. "Morning. I don't think that's a good idea. 3 hours ago, a CIA safe house in Istanbul was hit. 4 agents died, including Rebecca Martinez. Does that name mean anything to you? Sarah's grip tightened on the phone. Rebecca had been her handler during the Damascus operation, a sharp-eyed analyst who had coordinated intelligence gathering across the entire Syrian theater. More than that, she had been a friend, someone who understood the cost of the work they did and the weight of the secrets they carried. I'm listening. Not over the phone. Green Lake, Northeast parking area, 30 minutes. Come alone and make sure you're not followed. The line went dead, leaving Sarah staring at the phone while her mind processed implications and calculated risks. Rebecca's death changed everything. The Syrian operation had been classified at the highest levels, known only to a handful of people in Washington and the field operatives who had carried it out. If someone was targeting the team members, it meant their covers had been blown and they're carefully constructed. New lives were built on foundations of sand. She dressed quickly in dark jeans and a black jacket, checking the locks on her apartment door twice before slipping out into the Seattle night. The rain had intensified, turning the streets into rivers of reflected neon that reminded her uncomfortably of other cities. Other nights when stepping outside meant entering a world where death could arrive without warning. Green Lake at 3 a.m. was a different place than the daylight destination where joggers circled the water and families fed ducks from the shore. Now it was all shadows and empty space, the kind of environment where conversations could happen without witnesses or surveillance. Sarah parked her Honda Civic next to a stand of Douglas firs and waited, engine running and doors unlocked in case she needed to leave quickly. Harrison emerged from the darkness like a ghost, materializing beside her passenger door with the silent movement she remembered from their time in hostile territory. He slid into the seat without invitation, water dripping from his jacket onto her upholstery. "You look good for a dead woman," he said, studying her profile in the dim light from the dashboard. Rebecca? Tortured for information before they killed. Her professional work, the kind that takes time and expertise. They knew what they were looking for. Sarah stared out at the lake, its surface broken by rain into countless concentric circles that caught and scattered the distant streetlights. Rebecca had been tough, trained to resist interrogation and conditioned to protect operational security, even under extreme duress. If she had broken, it meant her captors had been very good at their job and very motivated to extract specific information. What did they get? Harrison pulled out a tablet, swiping to a series of photographs that made Sarah's stomach clench. The safe house had been thoroughly searched, documents scattered and computers destroyed, but the real message was in the Arabic graffiti spray-painted across the walls. She recognized the script immediately, the flowing calligraphy that belonged to a specific organization with a very long memory. Jaish al-Muqawama, she whispered, reading the words that translated roughly as Army of Resistance. It was the nom de guerre of a Syrian intelligence cell that had been hunting American operatives since the early days of the Civil War, led by a colonel named Rashid Qasim, who had turned eliminating Western assets into a personal crusade. Qasim survived the bombing in Aleppo, Harrison said. Burned over 60% of his body, lost his left eye and most of his right hand, but he survived. And apparently he's been very busy tracking down everyone who was involved in disrupting his operations. Sarah remembered Qasim, a soft-spoken man with a reputation for meticulous planning and absolute ruthlessness. He had been running a network that supplied weapons and intelligence to ISIS fighters, using Syrian government resources to support the very terrorists his country was supposedly fighting against. The operation to eliminate his network had required months of preparation and had ultimately saved hundreds of civilian lives, but it had also made powerful enemies. How many others? Martinez makes 4 confirmed kills. David Chen in Hong Kong, Angela Thompson in Berlin, Marcus Sullivan in Dubai, all within the past 6 weeks, all made to look like accidents or random crime until you know what to look for. The names hit Sarah like physical blows, each one representing a colleague who had risked everything in service of something larger than themselves. Chun had been a communications specialist like herself, fluent in Mandarin and Arabic, who had coordinated with Chinese intelligence services. Thompson had run assets inside the Syrian government, feeding crucial information about chemical weapons programs to coalition forces. Sullivan had been a logistics coordinator, the man who had somehow managed to supply Kurdish fighters with American equipment without leaving fingerprints that could embarrass either government. "We're the last two on the list," Sarah said, understanding now why Harrison had surfaced after 4 years of silence. "Not exactly. There's one more name, someone who is deeper cover than the rest of us. Someone Qasim has been hunting longer, and harder than anyone else." Harrison swiped to a new photograph, this one showing a different safe house, this one in Marseille. The same Arabic graffiti covered the walls, but this time it was accompanied by something else, a detailed floor plan of Moonbeam Coffee, complete with notes about Sarah's daily routine and the security weaknesses of her Capitol Hill apartment. "They found me 3 days ago," Harrison continued. "I've been running surveillance sweeps and counterintelligence protocols, but they're good. Very good, and they're getting help from someone with access to American intelligence databases." Sarah studied the floor plan, noting the professional attention to detail and the intimate knowledge of her habits. Someone had been watching her for weeks, maybe months, cataloging her movements and identifying the people in her life who could be used as leverage. Jessica's face flashed through her mind, followed by Mrs. Patterson and the regular customers, who trusted her to remember their orders and ask about their families. What do they want? Revenge, primarily, but also something specific. During the Damascus operation, you intercepted communications about a Syrian government weapons program. Chemical weapons, specifically sarin gas that was being moved through rebel territory to make it look like the opposition was using it against civilians. You relayed that intelligence to Washington, and it led to targeted strikes that destroyed the entire program. Sarah remembered the intercept, 3 minutes of Arabic conversation she had decoded, while Syrian forces closed in around their position. The intelligence had revealed a false flag operation designed to justify massive retaliation against civilian areas, a scheme that would have killed thousands of innocent people, while providing political cover for escalation. The program was run by Qasim's brother, a chemical weapons specialist named Omar Qasim. He died in the strikes, along with about 50 technicians and security personnel. Rashid has been hunting the intelligence source ever since. But there's more, isn't there? Sarah could read the tension in Harrison's posture, the way he held himself when delivering news that was worse than it appeared. Harrison nodded grimly. Qasim isn't just after revenge. He's rebuilt his network, expanded it across 3 continents, and he's planning something big. Something that requires eliminating everyone who might be able to recognize his operational signature or predict his methods. He swiped to the next image, a satellite photograph showing a compound in eastern Syria that Sarah didn't recognize. The buildings were new, constructed with the kind of precision that suggested significant financial backing and technical expertise. This facility went online 6 months ago. Our satellites have identified chemical production equipment, sophisticated communications arrays, and a training complex capable of housing about 200 personnel. Intelligence analysts believe it's a staging area for a major terrorist operation, but we can't penetrate their communications or place assets inside the compound, because they've learned from what happened before. They know how we work, how we think, what our capabilities are. Exactly. And they're using that knowledge to stay ahead of our countermeasures. Every time we try to infiltrate the network, our people end up dead. Every time we intercept their communications, we discover they've changed protocols. It's like fighting an enemy who knows our playbook better than we do. Sarah stared out at the lake, watching the rain create patterns on the water that appeared and dissolved in endless succession. She had spent 3 years convincing herself that the work she had done in Syria was finished, that the networks had been disrupted and the threats neutralized. Now she was discovering that her actions had simply driven the enemy underground, giving them time to adapt and evolve into something more dangerous than before. What makes you think I can help? I've been out of the game for 4 years. My security clearances have lapsed, my contacts have moved on to other assignments, and I've forgotten more about signals intelligence than I remember. Harrison turned to face her directly, his expression serious in the green glow from the dashboard. Because you're the only person alive who has heard Qasim's voice. During the Damascus operation, you intercepted a direct communication between Rashid and Omar Qasim discussing the timing of the chemical weapons program. You're the only intelligence asset who can positively identify his voice signature, recognize his speech patterns, and potentially predict his operational methods. The memory came flooding back, crystal clear despite the years that had passed. She had been crouched in the basement of a bombed-out apartment building, working with a damaged radio and a jury-rigged antenna while Syrian forces conducted house-to-house searches 3 blocks away. The signal had been weak and heavily encrypted, but she had managed to break through the interference long enough to record 3 minutes of conversation that had revealed the entire false flag operation. That Rashid Qasim's voice had been distinctive, educated and precise, with a slight lisp that became more pronounced when he was angry. She had listened to those 3 minutes dozens of times during the analysis phase, studying every inflection and pause for additional intelligence. The voice was burned into her memory with the permanence that came from associating sounds with life and death consequences. Even if I could identify his voice, what good would that do? I'm not an active intelligence operative anymore. I don't have access to intercept equipment or analytical resources. We're not asking you to go back into the field. We're asking you to help us identify communications intercepts and provide behavioral analysis based on your previous contact with Qasim. Consulting work, essentially, with full protection and compensation. Sarah knew there was more to it than Harrison was revealing, and could see the careful phrasing that indicated a larger operation with higher stakes than simple consulting work. But she also knew that Jessica Park would be opening the coffee shop in 3 hours, that Mrs. Patterson would be stopping by for her usual morning tea and conversation, that the life she had built one customer at a time was about to be swept away whether she cooperated or not. They're going to kill me either way, aren't they? Harrison didn't answer immediately, which was enough. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had delivered similar briefings before. Understood that some conversations changed lives irrevocably. Qasim's people are already in Seattle. We've identified at least 3 surveillance teams, possibly more. They're waiting for something, some kind of signal or confirmation before they make their move. Our analysts believe they're planning to take you alive, extract information about other operations and personnel before eliminating you. And if I help you, we have a chance of stopping them before they can complete their mission. Maybe preventing a major terrorist attack that could kill hundreds or thousands of people. And maybe, if we're very good and very lucky, ending Qasim's network permanently. Sarah looked at her hands, noting the small calluses from working the espresso machine and the faint burn scar from an accident with the steam wand. They were the hands of someone who made coffee and remembered customer names, someone who had found purpose in small acts of service that required nothing more than attention and care. But they were also the hands that had decoded the intelligence that had saved thousands of civilian lives in Syria, that had guided rescue teams through hostile territory and coordinated evacuations under enemy fire. The rain was beginning to ease, and she could see the first hint of gray dawn creeping across the eastern horizon. In a few hours, Seattle would wake up and expect the world to continue as it always had. with coffee shops opening and commuters hurrying to work and the comfortable illusion that safety was something that could be taken for granted. But Sarah knew that safety was a luxury maintained by people willing to risk everything to preserve it, and that sometimes the choice wasn't between danger and safety, but between different kinds of danger. What exactly are you asking me to do? Harrison reached into his jacket and pulled out a secure phone, the kind used for classified communications that couldn't be intercepted or traced. He set it on the console between them, its black surface reflecting the dashboard lights like a window into a world she had tried to leave behind. "Answer when it rings," he said, "and remember that some debts can only be repaid in kind." Sarah stared at the secure phone for 3 days, watching it sit motionless on her kitchen counter like a black hole that threatened to consume everything she had built. She went through the motions of normal life, opening Moonbeam Coffee each morning and serving the usual parade of customers, but her awareness had shifted into the hyper-alert state she remembered from Syria. Every face was potentially hostile. Every conversation might contain coded messages. Every shadow could conceal surveillance equipment or worse. Jessica noticed the change immediately. On Thursday morning, while Sarah mechanically prepared the seasonal menu board, the graduate student approached with the careful steps of someone navigating around unexploded ordnance. "Sarah, are you okay? You've been different since Tuesday, kind of distant and jumpy. Did something happen?" Sarah looked up from the chalk she'd been holding motionless for several minutes, realizing she had written the same drink description 3 times without noticing. Jessica's face was open with genuine concern, the kind of uncomplicated caring that belonged to someone whose biggest worry was finishing her thesis on post-conflict reconstruction theories. "Just tired, haven't been sleeping well with all this rain." It was a lie, but not entirely. Sarah hadn't slept more than 2 hours at a stretch since the meeting at Green Lake, her body refusing to relax while her mind cataloged potential threats and escape routes. She had installed additional locks on her apartment door, varied her route to work each morning, and started carrying pepper spray in her jacket pocket. Old habits returning with the persistence of muscle memory. Jessica nodded sympathetically, but Sarah could see the lingering doubt in her eyes. The younger woman had spent enough time studying conflict zones to recognize when someone was exhibiting signs of post-traumatic stress, even if she couldn't identify the specific trigger. "Maybe you should take a few days off? I could cover the shop, and you could get away from the city for a while. My family has a cabin up on Orcas Island that's empty this time of year." The offer was tempting, but Sarah knew that running wouldn't solve anything. Kasim's network had found her once, and they would find her again no matter where she went. The only real choice was between facing the threat actively or waiting passively for it to arrive at her door. "Thanks, but I'm fine, really." The morning passed with excruciating normalcy. Regular customers ordered their usual drinks and made small talk about the weather and weekend plans. Marcus from Microsoft complained about his latest project timeline. Jennifer asked about the new Ethiopian single origin blend. David ordered the seasonal pumpkin spice latte despite it being April and received it with the same enthusiasm he'd shown in October. But beneath the surface routine, Sarah's trained observer's eye was cataloging anomalies. The man in the Navy, Pico, who had been reading the same newspaper page for 40 minutes. The woman with the hiking boots who kept checking her phone but never seemed to receive any messages. The delivery van parked across the street that bore the logo of a company Sarah was certain didn't operate in Seattle. At 11:30 a.m., Mrs. Patterson arrived for her daily cup of chamomile tea and slice of lemon cake. The elderly woman had become one of Sarah's favorite customers, a retired librarian who treated everyone with the patient kindness that came from a lifetime of helping people find what they were looking for. She settled into her usual corner table with a contented sigh, pulling out a worn paperback novel and reading glasses held together with tape. "How are you today, dear?" Mrs. Patterson asked, accepting her tea with hands that trembled slightly from arthritis. "You look troubled." Sarah forced a smile, recognizing that her emotional state was apparently more transparent than she'd realized. If Mrs. Patterson could see through her facade, trained surveillance operatives certainly could. "Just thinking about some big decisions. You know how it is." Mrs. Patterson nodded sagely, stirring honey into her tea with slow, deliberate movements. "I've found that most big decisions aren't really about choosing between right and wrong. They're about choosing between different kinds of responsibility. The question isn't what you want to do, but what you can live with not doing." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, crystallizing the moral framework she'd been wrestling with since Harrison's revelation. She wasn't choosing between safety and danger, or even between her old life and her new one. She was choosing between different kinds of responsibility, different groups of people who depended on her making the right choice. There were Jessica and Mrs. Patterson, and all the regular customers who had become part of her daily existence. People who trusted her to be reliable and present, who had never asked her to risk anything more dangerous than experimenting with new coffee blends. Their lives would be simpler and safer if she walked away from whatever Harrison was asking her to do. But there were also the hundreds or thousands of people who might die if Qasim's network succeeded in their plans. Innocent civilians who would never know that their deaths could have been prevented by a barista in Seattle who had once intercepted a crucial communication in Syria. Their lives depended on her willingness to step back into a world she had tried to leave behind. And then there were the 4 colleagues who had already died. People who had served alongside her and deserved better than to have their sacrifices dismissed as acceptable losses in some larger strategic calculation. Rebecca Martinez had been tortured to death while protecting operational security. David Chun had been pushed in front of a Hong Kong subway train. Angela Thompson had been found floating in the Spree River with her throat cut. Marcus Sullivan had died in a hotel fire in Dubai that had consumed only his room while leaving the rest of the building untouched. Their deaths demanded justice, but they also demanded practical action. Qasim's network was using their murders to send a message about the cost of opposing Syrian intelligence operations. If Sarah allowed herself to be eliminated without fighting back, that message would be received by intelligence officers around the world who might hesitate to take necessary risks in future operations. The secure phone rang at 2:15 p.m. Its shrill tone cutting through the coffee shop's ambient noise like an alarm. Sarah stared at it for 3 rings before answering, aware that Jessica and several customers were watching her handle a device they'd never seen before. "Bennett, we have a problem." Harrison's voice was tight with controlled urgency. "Qasim's people made contact with someone in your personal circle. We intercepted communication suggesting they're planning to use leverage against you." Sarah felt the world narrow to a single point of focus, all background noise fading as her training asserted itself. "Who?" "We're not certain, but the intercept mentioned the student and afternoon shift. Does that mean anything to you?" Sarah's eyes found Jessica, who was restocking pastries behind the counter, while humming along to the indie rock playlist that served as the shop's soundtrack. The graduate student looked impossibly young and vulnerable, someone who belonged in seminar rooms and coffee shops, not in the crosshairs of international intelligence operations. "How much time do I have?" "Unknown." The communication was fragmented, possibly intentionally. "Our analysts believe they're waiting for some kind of confirmation before moving, but that could change at any moment." Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of Mrs. Patterson's words settling on her shoulders like a familiar burden. The choice wasn't between safety and danger anymore. It was between protecting the people in front of her, or protecting the cause in front of her, or protecting the people that canva. People she'd never meet. Between honoring her responsibility to those who trusted her daily presence, or those who depended on her specialized knowledge and experience. What do you need me to do? Harrison's relief was audible even over the encrypted connection. We've established a secure facility in Bellevue, former Microsoft Research Campus that's been converted for intelligence operations, full communication, suite, analytical resources, and protection protocols. We need you to review intercepted communications and provide voice identification on suspected CASM transmissions. And Jessica, protective custody if necessary. We have resources for civilian security, witness protection protocols if the situation escalates that far. Sarah looked around the coffee shop, taking inventory of the life she was about to abandon. The espresso machine required exactly the right pressure and timing to produce perfect crema. The corner table where Mrs. Patterson read her novels and dispensed gentle wisdom. The chalkboard menu that Jessica updated with seasonal drinks and inspirational quotes from famous authors. The community bulletin board covered with local art show announcements and yoga class schedules. All of it was about to become background. Scenery in someone else's story. Places and routines that would continue without her while she disappeared into the shadow world of intelligence operations and international manhunts. She had spent 3 years building this sanctuary cup by cup, relationship by relationship, and now she was going to tear it down in a single afternoon because duty called with a voice she couldn't ignore. But even as grief for her lost normalcy washed over her, Sarah felt something else stirring in her chest. The sense of purpose that had driven her through 4 years of diplomatic service. The recognition that some fights were worth any personal cost. She had joined the State Department because she believed in protecting people who couldn't protect themselves, and that core motivation hadn't changed despite her change in circumstances. I need 1 hour to arrange coverage and secure the shop. 30 minutes. CASM's surveillance teams are getting more active, and we can't guarantee your safety much longer. Sarah looked at Jessica, who was now watching her with undisguised concern. The younger woman had stopped humming and was standing motionless behind the counter, clearly sensing that whatever conversation Sarah was having would change things in ways she couldn't yet understand. Jessica, I need you to close the shop early today. Family emergency. The lie came easily, but Sarah could see that Jessica wasn't entirely convinced. Graduate students in international relations developed good instincts about when people were concealing information, especially information related to security concerns. Is there anything I can do to help? Actually, yes. I need you to stay with friends or family for the next few days. Maybe visit your parents or take that research trip to Vancouver you've been talking about. Now Jessica's concern shifted into something approaching an alarm. She approached the counter where Sarah was standing, lowering her voice to avoid being overheard by the remaining customers. Sarah, what's going on? This isn't about a family emergency, is it? The direct question hung between them like a bridge Sarah could either cross or burn. She could continue lying, could maintain the fiction that would allow Jessica to remain safely ignorant of the forces converging on their little coffee shop. Or she could tell enough of the truth to ensure that Jessica understood the gravity of the situation and took appropriate precautions. I used to work for the government in a different capacity. Some people from that time have surfaced, and they might try to use you to get to me. I need you somewhere safe while I deal with the situation. Jessica's eyes widened, but Sarah could see her analytical mind processing the information and reaching conclusions that were probably more accurate than comfort would dictate. Intelligence work? Something like that. And these people, they're dangerous? Sarah thought about Rebecca Martinez's torture and murder, about David Chen being pushed in front of a subway train, about Marcus Sullivan burning alive in a Dubai hotel room. Very. Jessica nodded slowly, her academic understanding of conflict zones suddenly becoming personal in ways her professors had never prepared her for. But instead of panic or recrimination, Sarah saw determination settling over the younger woman's features. What can I do to help? The question caught Sarah off guard. She had expected fear, confusion, maybe anger at being dragged into a situation she hadn't chosen. Instead, Jessica was offering assistance with the same matter-of-fact courage that Sarah remembered from her diplomatic colleagues who had volunteered for dangerous assignments because the work needed to be done. Go to your parents' house in Portland. Stay there until I call and tell you it's safe to come back. Don't use your regular phone or credit cards. And don't tell anyone where you're going, except your family. And the coffee shop? Sarah looked around at the space that had been her refuge and purpose for 3 years, knowing that she might never see it again. Even if she survived whatever was coming, her cover was blown and her civilian identity compromised. Moonbeam Coffee would need a new owner, and Jessica would need a new mentor. I'll make arrangements. The important thing is keeping you safe. The secure phone buzzed with an incoming text message. Time's up. Move now. Sarah grabbed her jacket and the emergency cash she kept in the register, leaving behind everything else that had defined her civilian existence. At the door, she turned back to see Jessica watching her with an expression that mixed understanding and determination. Sarah, whatever you used to do for the government, whatever these people want from you, just remember that you're not the same person you were back then. You've spent 3 years learning how to build things instead of destroying them. Don't forget that. The words followed Sarah out into the Seattle afternoon, where gray clouds were gathering with the promise of another storm. She walked toward her car with measured steps, hyper-aware of potential surveillance, but trying to project the casual confidence of someone running ordinary errands. Behind her, Moonbeam Coffee continued serving customers who had no idea that their barista had just stepped back into a war that had never really ended. And somewhere in the shadows of Pioneer Square, trained killers were adjusting their plans based on intelligence gathered through weeks of patient observation. The moral crossroads had become a point of no return, and Sarah Bennett was walking toward it with the steady determination of someone who had chosen responsibility over safety, duty over comfort, and truth over the comfortable lies that allowed ordinary life to continue unchanged at the former Microsoft research facility in Bellevue. Squatted behind 30-foot concrete walls like a digital fortress, its windowless exterior giving no hint of the sophisticated intelligence operation housed within. Sarah's Honda Civic looked absurdly civilian among the black SUVs and unmarked government sedans filling the parking garage, a reminder that she was crossing back into a world where appearances were carefully managed and nothing was quite what it seemed. Agent Lisa Chun, no relation to the murdered David Chun, met Sarah at the security checkpoint with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to processing high-value assets under time pressure. She was younger than Sarah had expected, probably early 30s, with the kind of sharp professional wardrobe that suggested FBI training and ambitious career goals. Ms. Bennett, I'm Agent Chun, NSA liaison for this operation. We'll need to process your credentials and conduct a brief security interview before accessing the facility. The interview took place in a sterile conference room equipped with recording equipment and biometric scanners that felt more like interrogation tools than administrative necessities. Sarah answered questions about her State Department service, her knowledge of Syrian intelligence networks, and her specific interactions with the Qassem brothers during the Damascus operation. But she could sense that Chun was evaluating more than just her qualifications. She was assessing Sarah's psychological readiness to re-enter a world she had deliberately left behind. Your file indicates you declined multiple opportunities for continued government service after your medical discharge, Chun said, consulting the tablet that presumably contained Sarah's entire professional history. What changed your mind about returning to intelligence work? Sarah thought about Jessica's worried face, about Mrs. Patterson's gentle wisdom, about the 4 colleagues who had died because someone with a very long memory held grudges with lethal precision. The work followed me home. I'd rather deal with it on my terms than wait for it to find me on theirs. Chun nodded approvingly, making notes that would presumably influence Sarah's security clearance and operational assignments. The FBI agent had the analytical mindset that Sarah remembered from her diplomatic service, the ability to reduce complex human motivations to risk assessments and behavioral predictions. Harrison appeared as the interview concluded, looking more like his military self in tactical clothing and communications gear. He guided Sarah through a maze of corridors, lined with server farms and technical equipment that hummed with the constant activity of data processing and signal analysis. "Welcome back to the war," he said, using his security badge to open blast doors that led to the facility's operational center. The room beyond resembled a scaled-down version of the National Security Agency's main operations floor, with dozens of workstations arranged around massive wall displays showing global communication patterns and threat assessments. Technicians wearing headphones monitored signal intercepts while analysts studied satellite imagery and communication transcripts. The familiar controlled chaos of an intelligence operation at full capacity. "We've been monitoring Qasim's network for 6 months," Harrison explained, leading Sarah to a workstation equipped with specialized audio equipment and translation software. "Multiple frequencies, various encryption methods, but we haven't been able to identify his personal communications. He's using voice modulation software and routing calls through proxy servers in at least 12 countries." Sarah settled into the chair, her hands automatically adjusting the headphone positioning and audio levels with muscle memory from her diplomatic service. The equipment was more sophisticated than what she'd used in Syria, but the fundamental task remained the same: listening for patterns in human communication that revealed operational intentions and tactical planning. "Show me what you have." The first intercept played through high-quality speakers, revealing a conversation in Arabic between two men discussing logistics for moving personnel and equipment. The voices were electronically modified, pitched lower, and filtered to mask identifying characteristics. But Sarah could detect subtle patterns in pronunciation and sentence structure that suggested educational backgrounds and regional origins. "This speaker is from Damascus, probably university educated," she said after listening to the first 30 seconds. "The second voice is from Aleppo, working class background based on his grammar patterns. Neither of them is Qasim." Harrison leaned forward, studying the translation software's analysis of the conversation. "How can you be certain?" "Qasim speaks modern Standard Arabic with influences from classical poetry. He studied literature before joining the intelligence service, and it shows in his word choices and rhetorical patterns. These men are discussing practical matters using technical vocabulary. Qasim would never coordinate logistics personally. He'd delegate that to subordinates while maintaining strategic oversight." The analysis continued for 3 hours, with Sarah reviewing dozens of intercepts while technicians adjusted filters and signal processing algorithms to enhance audio quality. Most of the conversations involved mid-level operatives discussing routine security matters, supply chain logistics, and personnel movements that painted a picture of an organization in the final stages of operational preparation, but it wasn't until the 14th intercept that Sarah heard something that made her blood freeze. The voice was speaking English with a slight accent, discussing surveillance protocols and target verification procedures. But beneath the electronic distortion, Sarah recognized speech patterns that had been burned into her memory during 3 minutes of intercepted conversation 4 years earlier. "Stop, replay that section." Harrison signaled the technician, who isolated the relevant audio segment and played it through the speakers again. This time, Sarah closed her eyes and listened with the trained focus that had once made her one of the State Department's most effective signals intelligence specialists. "Confirm visual identification of the primary target. She maintains a regular schedule, arrives at location 0615 hours local time, closes establishment 1800 hours. Security protocols minimal. Civilian population provides operational cover. The voice belonged to Rashid Qasim, speaking English to avoid Arabic translators, but unable to completely mask the vocal characteristics that made him identifiable to someone who had studied his communication patterns. The slight lisp became more pronounced on certain consonants. The careful pronunciation that suggested someone speaking in a second language. The formal grammar structures that reflected his intelligence training. "That's him," Sarah said, opening her eyes to find Harrison and Agent Chun studying her intently. Rashid Qasim, recorded within the last 48 hours based on the technical quality and encryption methods. "You're certain?" Sarah nodded, feeling the weight of absolute conviction. That came from specialized expertise applied to familiar patterns. He's talking about surveillance of a primary target with a predictable schedule and minimal security. Given the timeline, he's probably talking about me. Harrison exchanged glances with Agent Chun, confirming what Sarah had already deduced from the operational tempo and resource allocation around the facility. This wasn't just a consulting assignment or analytical support role. She had been brought in as bait for a trap that would require her to serve as both hunter and prey. "The plan is more complex than I initially described," Harrison admitted. "We've been feeding Qasim's network intelligence about your daily routine, while secretly preparing a counter-surveillance operation. When his people move against you, we'll be ready to capture them and trace the communication back to his operational base." Sarah absorbed this information while calculating the personal implications. She would be returning to Seattle, resuming her normal routine, serving coffee while trained killers planned her abduction and murder. The difference was that this time, she would be under protection and surveillance from American intelligence assets who were using her as a stalking horse to draw out a much larger prey. "What about Jessica and the other civilians in my life?" "Full protective surveillance. We have teams assigned to everyone in your personal circle, and we've established protocols for immediate extraction if the situation escalates beyond our ability to control." Agent Chun pulled up a tactical display showing the area around Moonbeam Coffee, with colored symbols indicating the positions of surveillance teams, communication intercept stations, and rapid response assets. The level of planning and resource allocation was impressive, but Sarah knew from experience that operational plans rarely survived contact with enemies who were equally well-trained and motivated. Qasim isn't stupid. He'll recognize signs of increased security presence, especially if his people have been conducting surveillance for weeks. "That's why we need you to act naturally. Maintain your normal routine while we monitor his network's communications. Any deviation from established patterns might spook them into changing tactics or calling off the operation entirely." Sarah studied the tactical display, noting the careful positioning of assets to provide overlapping coverage while remaining invisible to casual observation. The operation represented the kind of multi-layered planning that intelligence agencies excelled at, combining technical resources with human assets to create comprehensive surveillance networks, but she also recognized the fundamental vulnerability that no amount of planning could eliminate. She would be exposed and dependent on other people's competence and commitment for her survival. If the surveillance teams missed something, if the communication intercepts failed to provide adequate warning, if Qasim's people used tactics that hadn't been anticipated, she would face the same fate as Rebecca Martinez and the other murdered operatives. "There's something else," Harrison continued, his expression suggesting information that was worse than what he'd already revealed. "Intelligence analysts believe Qasim's network is planning to use your capture as part of a larger operation. The chemical weapons facility in Syria is operational, and they're preparing to move significant quantities of sarin gas to an undisclosed location." Sarah felt the familiar weight of information that transformed personal danger into strategic necessity. Qasim wasn't just seeking revenge against the people who had disrupted his previous operations. He was using their elimination as cover for a new phase of terrorist planning that could dwarf anything he had attempted before. They're going to torture me for information about other intelligence assets and operational methods, then use that information to improve their security while conducting a major chemical attack. That's the assessment, which is why we need to capture his people before they can extract any useful intelligence from you, and why we need to trace their communications back to the Syrian facility while they still believe they're operational. Security is intact. The moral calculus was becoming clear. Sarah's capture and interrogation might save hundreds or thousands of civilian lives if it led to the disruption of Qasim's chemical weapons program. But it would also mean enduring torture at the hands of professionals who had already demonstrated their willingness to inflict maximum suffering in pursuit of strategic objectives. Agent Chun activated a secure communication link, her voice taking on the formal cadence of someone delivering official briefing materials. The operation has been designated Nightingale Song in honor of your previous call sign and the communications intelligence that initiated this entire investigation. You'll be equipped with subcutaneous tracking devices and emergency communication gear that should allow us to monitor your location and condition, even if you're taken to a secondary site. The technology is sophisticated, but Qasim's people have proven adept at electronic countermeasures. We'll do everything possible to maintain contact, but you need to be prepared for the possibility of operating without backup for extended periods. Sarah looked around the operations center, taking inventory of the resources and personnel being dedicated to an operation that would ultimately depend on her willingness to walk into a trap that might kill her. Dozens of intelligence professionals working around the clock to provide support and analysis. Millions of dollars in technical equipment monitoring communications and tracking movements. Tactical teams standing by to provide rapid response if the situation deteriorated beyond acceptable parameters. All of it focused on using her as bait to catch a man whose personal vendetta had become a strategic threat to American national security. When do I go back? Harrison checked his watch, noting the time with the precision of someone coordinating multiple operational elements across different time zones. Tomorrow morning. Resume normal operations at Moonbeam Coffee, maintain your established routine, and wait for Qasim's people to make their move. We estimate 48 to 72 hours before they attempt contact. Sarah nodded, accepting the timeline that would determine whether she lived or died, based on the competence of people she barely knew and the accuracy of intelligence assessments that might be wrong. But even as fears settled into her stomach, like cold metal, she felt something else stirring in her chest. The sense of purpose that had driven her through 4 years of diplomatic service was reasserting itself with the clarity that came from moral certainty. Qasim's network represented everything she had joined the government to oppose: the willingness to murder innocents in service of political objectives, the patient cruelty that treated human suffering as an acceptable cost of achieving strategic goals. If stopping them required her to serve as bait in a trap that might kill her, that was simply the price of keeping faith with the victims who had already died and the potential victims who still might be saved. Sarah Bennett was going back to work. But this time, she would be serving more than coffee. Sarah opened Moonbeam Coffee at 6:15 a.m. on Friday morning, her movements carrying the same practiced efficiency they had for 3 years. But now every gesture was performed with the awareness that trained observers were cataloging her behavior for signs of deviation from established patterns. The subcutaneous tracking device implanted behind her left ear itched slightly, a constant reminder that she was no longer just a barista serving the morning rush. The surveillance teams were invisible but omnipresent. Agent Chun had briefed her on their positions: the utility worker reading meters across the street, the jogger who passed the shop every 20 minutes, the food delivery driver whose motorcycle was equipped with directional microphones and high-resolution cameras. Even Mrs. Patterson, settling into her corner table with chamomile tea and a new romance novel, was under discreet protective observation by agents posing as Seattle Public Library maintenance staff. Jessica had returned from her forced vacation. In Portland that morning, her usual cheerful energy, subdued by the knowledge that her workplace had become the center of an international intelligence operation. She moved through her opening routine with careful attention to normalcy, but Sarah could see the tension in her shoulders and the way her eyes automatically checked the exits every few minutes. Any word on when things might get back to normal? Jessica asked quietly while restocking the pastry case, keeping her voice low enough to avoid the acoustic surveillance that might be monitoring their conversations. "Soon, I hope," Sarah replied, though she knew that normal was a luxury she might never experience again. Even if Operation Nightingale Song succeeded in capturing Qasim's operatives, her cover identity was permanently compromised. The life she had built cup by cup over 3 years was already dissolving, replaced by the harsh realities of being a high-value intelligence asset. The morning proceeded with agonizing normalcy until 10:23 a.m., when Sarah's hyper-tuned awareness detected the first anomaly. A man in a gray wool coat had been sitting at the window table for 47 minutes, nursing a single espresso while reading the Financial Times. His positioning provided clear sightlines to both the counter and the rear exit, and his newspaper hadn't been turned in over 20 minutes. Sarah activated the emergency communication system by touching her right earlobe twice, a gesture that would alert the surveillance teams to increased threat levels without appearing suspicious to casual observers. Within seconds, her subcutaneous receiver vibrated with a barely perceptible acknowledgement that her signal had been received and evaluated. The man in the gray coat left at 10:31 a.m., but Sarah's trained instincts told her that the surveillance assessment had concluded. Qasim's people had finished their final reconnaissance and were moving to the operational phase. The trap was about to spring, but the question remained whether the American surveillance teams would be quick enough to capture the predators before they could eliminate their prey. Agent Chun's voice crackled through Sarah's earpiece at 11:15 a.m., transmitted through bone conduction technology that was undetectable to electronic surveillance equipment. "Multiple vehicles converging on your location. Professional-grade approach patterns. Estimate contact in 12 minutes." Sarah's hands continued grinding coffee beans while her mind shifted into the hyper-alert state she remembered from Syria. Every customer became a potential threat. Every shadow could conceal hostile observers. Every sound might herald the arrival of operatives who had already tortured 4 of her former colleagues to death. The attack came at 11:27 a.m. with the swift efficiency of professionals who had spent weeks planning every detail. 2 men in maintenance coveralls entered through the front door, while a third blocked the rear exit, their movements coordinated with the precision that spoke of extensive training and detailed preparation. The customers Marcus from Microsoft, Jennifer with her Pike Place roast, David with his seasonal drink obsession, suddenly became hostages in an operation they couldn't possibly understand. "Everyone on the ground now," commanded the lead operative in accented English, producing a compact submachine gun from beneath his coveralls. His face was covered by a ski mask, but his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Sarah dropped behind the counter, her hand moving instinctively toward the panic button that would alert the surveillance teams to immediate extraction needs. But before she could activate the device, she felt cold metal pressed against the base of her skull and heard a familiar voice speaking in Arabic. "Sayyadati Sarah Bennett, we have been looking forward to this conversation for a very long time." The voice belonged to someone she didn't recognize, but the formal address and careful pronunciation suggested Syrian intelligence training. These weren't random criminals or opportunistic kidnappers. They were professionals sent by Rashid Qasim to collect a debt that had been accumulating interest for 4 years. Jessica was forced to the floor beside the espresso machine, her eyes wide with terror but her movements controlled by the kind of survival instincts that kept people alive during violent encounters. Mrs. Patterson had been pushed into the corner booth, her romance novel forgotten as she clutched her purse with trembling hands and whispered what sounded like prayers. The lead operative spoke into a throat microphone, coordinating with external assets in rapid Arabic that Sarah translated automatically. Package secured. Civilians under control. Extraction route confirmed. Moving to Phase 2 in 60 seconds. Sarah knew that Phase 2 meant leaving the coffee shop with her as a prisoner, beginning an interrogation process that would continue until she revealed everything she knew about American intelligence operations in Syria, or until she died from the accumulated damage of professional torture. The surveillance teams had perhaps 90 seconds to intervene before she disappeared into a nightmare that would end with her death and the compromise of critical national security assets. But something was wrong. The American response was too slow, too tentative. Agent Chun's voice should have been flooding her earpiece with updates and instructions, but the bone conduction system remained silent. Either the communication equipment had malfunctioned, or the surveillance teams had been neutralized before they could provide support. The terrible possibility settled in Sarah's mind with the weight of absolute certainty. Qasim's network had identified the American surveillance operation and eliminated it as part of their tactical planning. She was alone in the coffee shop with trained killers who had spent 4 years planning her capture, and no help was coming. One of the operatives zip-tied her hands behind her back while another conducted a professional search for hidden weapons or communication devices. They found the subcutaneous tracking implant within seconds, extracting it with a small surgical blade and crushing it beneath their boots. The emergency communication equipment followed, identified and destroyed with the efficiency that spoke of extensive training in counter-surveillance techniques. "Dr. Qasim sends his regards," the lead operative said, leaning close enough that Sarah could smell cigarettes and aftershave through his ski mask. "He is looking forward to renewing your acquaintance and discussing your previous interference in Syrian internal affairs." They hauled Sarah to her feet and began moving toward the rear exit, where a van was presumably waiting to transport her to whatever location had been prepared for extended interrogation. But as they reached the back door, everything went catastrophically wrong in ways that no operational plan could have anticipated. The explosion came from the direction of Pioneer Square, a massive detonation that shattered windows 3 blocks away and sent shockwaves through the coffee shop's brick walls. Car alarms began wailing across downtown Seattle, while emergency sirens provided a discordant soundtrack to chaos that was spreading through the city like wildfire. The Syrian operatives froze, speaking rapidly into their throat microphones while trying to determine whether the explosion was related to their operation or represented an entirely separate crisis. In that moment of confusion, Sarah heard the distinctive whine of helicopter rotors approaching from multiple directions, followed by the amplified voice of someone speaking through military-grade sound equipment. "This is the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The building is surrounded. Release all hostages and surrender immediately." The lead operative cursed in Arabic, recognizing that their carefully planned extraction had been compromised by circumstances beyond their control. But instead of surrendering, he made a decision that transformed the coffee shop into a battlefield and Sarah into the center of a firefight that would determine whether Operation Nightingale Song succeeded or failed catastrophically. "Of plans," he announced to his team in Arabic. "We interrogate her here and transmit the intelligence in real time. Dr. Qasim's questions can be answered even if we don't survive to deliver her personally." Sarah's blood turned to ice as she realized the implications. Instead of being transported to a secure location where American intelligence assets might eventually track her down, she was going to be tortured to death in her own coffee shop while Qasim listened to every scream and extracted every piece of information she possessed about American operations in Syria. The operative produced a tactical communication setup. From an equipment bag, establishing encrypted contact with someone who could only be Rashid Qasim himself. Within moments, the familiar voice that had haunted Sarah's nightmares was speaking through high-quality speakers positioned around the coffee shop. "Miss Bennett, or should I say Nightingale, you cost me my brother, my network, and considerable resources. Now you will help me recover all three through the information you will provide." Sarah looked around the coffee shop at the innocent people who had become pawns in an international intelligence operation they couldn't possibly understand. Jessica was pressed against the wall near the espresso machine, her face pale but her eyes focused with the kind of desperate clarity that came from recognizing that survival depended on staying alert and ready to act. Mrs. Patterson was hunched in the corner booth, her elderly frame shaking with fear, but her gaze steady as she watched the operatives with the keen observation skills that came from a lifetime of helping people find what they needed. The hostages weren't just collateral damage in someone else's war. They were people who had trusted Sarah to provide them with coffee and conversation, who had welcomed her into their daily routines and treated her like family. Their lives were about to become the price of information that could compromise dozens of American intelligence assets and enable terrorist attacks that might kill thousands of innocent civilians. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, Sarah felt something else stirring in her chest. The same determination that had driven her through 4 years of diplomatic service, that had made her willing to decode enemy communications while mortar rounds fell around her position. She might be outnumbered and outgunned, but she wasn't helpless. And she sure as hell wasn't going to let Qasim's people torture information out of her while civilians watched. The breaking point had arrived. But Sarah Bennett was done being broken. Sarah had 30 seconds before the interrogation began. 30 seconds to transform from victim to combatant while zip-tied hands and professional killers eliminated her conventional options for resistance. But 4 years of diplomatic service in hostile territory had taught her that survival often depended on unconventional solutions, and that sometimes the most effective weapons were the ones that enemies didn't recognize as threats. The coffee shop's layout became a tactical map in her mind. The industrial espresso machine with its pressurized steam wands and scalding water reservoir. The grinder filled with pounds of coffee beans that could blind and disorient in confined spaces. The vintage Edison bulbs hanging from exposed electrical conduits that could be shattered to create darkness and chaos. Most importantly, the main electrical panel behind the counter that controlled power to the entire building. "Dr. Qasim," she said loudly, addressing the voice coming through the communications equipment. "Before we begin this conversation, I want you to know that your brother Omar died screaming my name." The lie was calculated to enrage Qasim into making emotional rather than tactical decisions, but it also served a more immediate purpose. While the Syrian operatives focused on her provocative words, Sarah was backing toward the electrical panel. With small, seemingly involuntary movements that appeared to be fear-driven retreat rather than tactical positioning, Qasim's voice crackled through the speakers with barely controlled fury. "You will suffer for every moment of pain you caused. My family. But first, you will tell us about the American intelligence networks operating in Syria, the names and locations of your assets, and the operational methods used to penetrate our security." The lead operative approached with a ceramic knife designed to inflict maximum pain while keeping victims conscious and responsive. Sarah had seen the results of such interrogations in intelligence briefings, photographs of Rebecca Martinez, and the others that had been classified too sensitive for general distribution. The torture would be methodical and scientific, designed to extract information through the precise application of agony. But as the operative raised his weapon, Sarah made her move. She threw herself backward into the electrical panel, using her shoulder to smash the protective cover and expose the main circuit breakers. The collision sent electrical sparks cascading across her back and arms. but it also plunged the coffee shop into complete darkness, while simultaneously triggering the building's fire suppression system. Water began raining from the ceiling sprinklers as emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red illumination. The Syrian operatives shouted commands in Arabic while trying to maintain control of a situation that had suddenly shifted from organized interrogation to chaotic firefight. Sarah rolled behind the counter as automatic weapons fire shattered the espresso machine and sent ceramic fragments flying through the air like shrapnel. The pressurized steam system exploded in a cloud of scalding vapor that filled the air with white fog and the screams of men who had been caught in the blast radius. "Jessica, get Mrs. Patterson and move toward the front exit," Sarah shouted over the sound of gunfire and breaking glass. "Stay low and don't stop moving." But Jessica was already in motion, having used the confusion to break free from her position near the wall. The graduate student grabbed Mrs. Patterson's arm and began half-carrying the elderly woman toward the door while the operatives fired blindly through the steam and smoke. Sarah found the bag of espresso beans she kept for the Sunday rush and began hurling handfuls into the air, creating a cloud of projectiles that struck the operatives' faces and interfered with their night vision equipment. It wasn't lethal force, but it bought precious seconds while she searched for something more substantial. Her hand closed around the ceramic coffee pot. That had been Mrs. Chun's prized possession, a handmade piece that had survived 3 years of daily service. Sarah whispered a brief apology to her former boss and hurled the pot with all her strength at the lead operative's head. The impact knocked him backward into the communications equipment, severing Kassem's connection and silencing the voice that had been coordinating the operation. But the remaining operatives were adapting to the changed tactical situation, using their superior numbers and professional training to corner Sarah behind increasingly inadequate cover. That's when the real cavalry arrived. The FBI tactical team breached the coffee shop through both the front entrance and the rear service door. Their coordinated assault, illuminated by red emergency lighting and the strobing muzzle flashes of automatic weapons. But these weren't the surveillance agents who had supposedly been monitoring the operation. These were the specialized hostage rescue specialists who had been held in reserve for exactly this kind of tactical emergency. Agent Chun's voice cut through the chaos with the amplified authority of military-grade communications equipment. "Federal agents, drop your weapons and surrender immediately. This is your only warning." The Syrian operatives chose to fight rather than surrender, turning the coffee shop into a killing field where professional soldiers engaged in close-quarters combat. Among the scattered furniture and brewing equipment that had once defined Sarah's peaceful civilian existence, the gunfight lasted less than 90 seconds, but those seconds contained enough violence to transform the space permanently from sanctuary to battlefield. When the smoke cleared and the shooting stopped, 2 of the Syrian operatives were dead, and the third was wounded but alive, zip-tied and receiving medical attention from FBI medics who had been standing by for casualty treatment. Sarah found herself sitting on the floor behind the destroyed counter, her hands finally freed from the zip ties and her body shaking with the adrenaline aftermath of combat she hadn't experienced since Damascus. "Sarah, are you hurt?" Jessica was kneeling beside her, checking for wounds with the careful attention of someone who had just watched her mentor fight off professional killers using coffee shop equipment as improvised weapons. "I'm fine," Sarah lied, though she could feel burns from the electrical panel and cuts from flying glass that would require medical attention. "Mrs. Patterson?" Shaken but unharmed. "The paramedics are checking her blood pressure, but she's demanding to know when she can come back for her usual afternoon tea." Sarah laughed despite everything, recognizing the stubborn normalcy that allowed ordinary people to survive extraordinary circumstances by focusing on the small rituals that provided meaning and continuity. Mrs. Patterson's concern about her tea schedule was a reminder that life continued even after violence. that the world rebuilt itself one small routine at a time. Harrison appeared through the smoke and emergency lighting, his expression mixing relief with professional assessment of tactical outcomes. The prisoner is talking. Qasim's Syrian facility, operational timelines, the chemical weapons program. Everything we needed to prevent the terrorist attack and more. And Qasim himself. Drone strike authorized by National Command Authority 37 minutes ago. The facility in eastern Syria no longer exists, and neither does Rashid Qasim or the remainder of his network. Your intelligence and the prisoner's confession provided targeting data that eliminated a threat to thousands of potential victims. Sarah nodded, feeling the weight of completion that came with missions accomplished and debts finally paid. Rebecca, Martinez and the other murdered operatives had been avenged. Qasim's chemical weapons program had been destroyed. The terrorist attack had been prevented. But the cost had been measured in the destruction of everything she had built over 3 years of careful civilian reconstruction. Moonbeam Coffee was a crime scene now, its windows blown out and its interior destroyed by gunfire and FBI tactical operations. The espresso machine that had served thousands of customers was scattered in pieces across the floor. The corner booth where Mrs. Patterson had read her romance novels was overturned and bullet-riddled. The chalkboard menu that Jessica had updated with seasonal drinks and inspirational quotes was cracked and illegible. What happens now? Jessica asked, surveying the wreckage of the place that had employed her and shaped her understanding of how small businesses could serve as community anchors. Sarah looked around at the destruction, then at Harrison and Agent Chun, who were already coordinating with federal prosecutors and intelligence analysts to exploit the captured operatives. Information. The world of international espionage had reclaimed her permanently, erasing the fiction that she could ever return to serving coffee and remembering customer names. Now we clean up the mess and figure out what comes next, she said, helping Jessica to her feet while paramedics continued treating Mrs. Patterson for shock and minor injuries, but even as federal agents processed the crime scene and removed the bodies of foreign operatives who had died on American soil, Sarah felt something unexpected stirring in her chest. Not just the satisfaction of completed vengeance or successful mission accomplishment, but a sense of possibility that hadn't existed when she thought her only choice was between hiding and dying. She had proven that civilian life and intelligence work weren't mutually exclusive, that the skills required for both were more complementary than contradictory. Protecting people, building communities, serving something larger than personal interest, those motivations transcended professional categories and institutional boundaries. Jessica was studying her with the analytical intensity that had made her a promising graduate student in international relations. You're not going back to just serving coffee, are you? Sarah smiled, feeling the weight of future possibilities settling on her shoulders like a familiar and welcome burden. Maybe not just coffee, but definitely still serving people who need help. Agent Chun approached with a tablet containing preliminary damage assessments and debriefing schedules. But also with something else, a job offer that would allow Sarah to use her specialized skills in service of American national security while maintaining the community connections that had given her civilian life meaning. The Bureau has a new program for former intelligence operatives who want to maintain cover identities in civilian communities, while serving as local assets for counterintelligence operations. You'd be rebuilding Moonbeam Coffee with federal backing, serving real customers and providing genuine community services, but also monitoring for foreign intelligence activities and providing secure communications for federal operations. Sarah looked at Jessica, who was nodding with the enthusiasm of someone who had just discovered that academic theories about public-private partnerships in national security could be applied in practical and personally meaningful ways. Would there be positions for graduate student researchers who are interested in studying how coffee shops can serve as community resilience hubs during international security crises? Agent Chun consulted her tablet, then smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had just solved multiple personnel problems simultaneously. I think we can find funding for that kind of research, especially if the researcher is already familiar with the operational environment and is proven capable under extreme stress. Sarah Bennett looked around the destroyed coffee shop that had been her sanctuary and was now her battlefield, recognizing that some transformations were permanent and irreversible. She would never again be just a barista who served coffee and remembered customer names. But she might be something better, someone who served coffee and protected the community that depended on her for both. 2 years after the firefight that destroyed her sanctuary, Sarah Bennett stood behind the counter of the rebuilt Moonbeam. Coffee, grinding beans for the morning rush with the same practiced precision she had maintained for 5 years. The new espresso machine was more sophisticated than its predecessor, equipped with federal-grade communication equipment concealed within its stainless steel housing. The vintage Edison bulbs had been replaced with LED fixtures that could provide tactical lighting at the touch of a concealed switch. The corner booth where Mrs. Patterson had read romance novels now contained emergency communication protocols hidden beneath its reclaimed wood surface. But to the customers filing through the door at 6:45 a.m., it was simply the neighborhood coffee shop that had reopened after renovations following a kitchen fire. Marcus from Microsoft still ordered his double-shot cortado with oat milk. Jennifer maintained her loyalty to Pike Place roast with room for cream that she never added. David continued his passionate relationship with whatever seasonal drink appeared on the chalkboard, though he now received those drinks from a woman who had killed foreign operatives using improvised weapons. The transformation had been more subtle than Sarah had anticipated. Instead of creating a cover identity that concealed her true purpose, she had found a way to integrate her intelligence work with genuine community service in ways that strengthened both missions. The coffee shop served as a neighborhood gathering place where people felt safe discussing their concerns about unusual activities or suspicious behavior. The informal intelligence network that emerged from casual conversations and community trust had already identified 2 foreign surveillance operations and prevented a cyber attack targeting Seattle's port facilities. Jessica Park had completed her master's thesis on community-based counterintelligence, small business integration with national security operations, earning recognition from both academic reviewers and federal analysts who were studying her research for broader application. She now managed the coffee shop's day-to-day operations while pursuing a PhD in international security studies. Her academic work funded by grants that didn't officially exist in any university budget. "Your 9 o'clock appointment is here, Jessica," said quietly, nodding toward a young man in a navy dress uniform who had just entered the shop. His bearing and the careful way he scanned the interior before approaching the counter identified him as active military, probably special operations based on his physical conditioning and tactical awareness. "Petty Officer, First Class Daniel Rodriguez." No relation to Sarah's former identity approached with the diffident respect that junior personnel showed when meeting senior operatives whose reputations exceeded their apparent civilian status. He was 24 years old, a communications specialist with 2 deployments to Afghanistan and a security clearance that had brought him to the attention of people who recruited assets for missions that didn't appear in official records. "Ma'am, I was told to ask about the house blend," he said, using the code phrase that identified him as part of a new program that trained military communications specialists to operate in civilian environments. Sarah poured a cup of her signature dark roast and set it on the counter between them, studying Rodriguez with the analytical attention that had once made her valuable to State Department operations. He was nervous but disciplined, eager to prove himself but still uncertain about the transition from military structure to the ambiguous world of intelligence work. "The house blend requires patience and attention to detail," she replied, completing. the authentication sequence while beginning his informal evaluation. Some people find it too strong at first, but it grows on you once you understand the complexity. Rodriguez nodded, accepting both the coffee and the metaphor. Over the next hour, while Sarah continued serving regular customers, she conducted a recruitment interview disguised as casual conversation about coffee preferences and brewing techniques. Rodriguez's communication skills were impressive. His languages included Arabic and Farsi, and his psychological profile suggested the kind of moral flexibility required for long-term deep cover operations. But more importantly, he possessed the quality that Sarah had learned to value above technical skills or academic credentials: the willingness to serve something larger than personal ambition, even when that service required sacrificing the comfortable anonymity that most people took for granted. "The work isn't glamorous," Sarah told him while demonstrating the proper steaming technique for cappuccino foam. "Most days, you'll be serving coffee and remembering customer names. But occasionally, you'll hear something or see something that requires immediate action. The challenge is recognizing which conversations matter and responding appropriately without compromising your cover or endangering civilians." Rodriguez accepted the assignment that afternoon, beginning a training program that would eventually place him in a coffee shop in Portland where federal analysts, SUSPECT, Foreign Intelligence Services were using local businesses to recruit American assets. He was the 15th candidate Sarah had evaluated in the past year, part of a nationwide network of businesses that served both their communities and their country through integrated intelligence operations. The program had attracted attention from international partners who were adapting similar models for their own domestic security needs. Sarah had briefed intelligence services from Canada, Australia, and the United Kingdom on the operational methods that allowed community businesses to provide genuine civilian services while maintaining security awareness and communication capabilities. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition had come from an unexpected source. Mrs. Patterson, now 83 years old and still a daily customer, had approached Sarah 6 months earlier with a request that initially seemed routine but revealed depths of understanding that federal analysts had missed. "Dear, I know you're doing important work that you can't discuss," the elderly woman had said while settling into her rebuilt corner booth with chamomile tea and a new mystery novel. "But I want you to know that this community feels safer because you're here. Not because of the government work, but because you've shown us that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they're willing to sacrifice for others." Mrs. Patterson had lived through World War II, the Cold War, and September 11th. She understood that freedom was preserved by individuals who were willing to risk everything to protect people they would never meet. Her recognition of Sarah's dual role had come not from intelligence briefings or security clearances, but from the wisdom that accumulated through 8 decades of observing how communities survived crises through the courage of people who refused to be bystanders. The validation meant more to Sarah than official commendations or career advancement. It confirmed that the integration of intelligence work with community service wasn't just operationally effective, it was morally necessary in a world where threats to security increasingly targeted the social fabric that held democratic societies together. Agent Shun visited monthly to discuss operational status and evaluate new intelligence requirements, but their relationship had evolved beyond the formal protocols of federal supervision. Chun had become a friend who understood the psychological challenges of maintaining dual identities and the emotional cost of serving communities while concealing the true nature of that service. "The program is being expanded to 12 new cities," Chun reported during her most recent briefing. "Coffee shops, bookstores, community centers, even food trucks. The model you developed is providing intelligence dividends that exceed anything we projected. But more importantly, it's strengthening community resilience in ways that traditional security programs never achieved." Sarah nodded, recognizing That her personal journey from diplomatic service to civilian sanctuary to integrated intelligence operations had become something larger than individual career development. She had helped create a new framework for national security that strengthened both protection and community rather than requiring citizens to choose between safety and freedom. Harrison had been promoted to full colonel and assigned to the Pentagon, where he coordinated similar programs across all military branches. But he still called occasionally to check on Sarah's welfare and discuss operational lessons that might apply to other environments. Their shared experience in Syria had created bonds that transcended organizational boundaries and professional hierarchies. "You've built something unique," Harrison had told her during his last visit. "Most intelligence operations extract resources from communities. Yours adds value while providing security. That's a sustainable model that could transform how we think about domestic counterintelligence." But sustainability required more than operational success. It required personal meaning that could justify the sacrifices and sustain motivation. Through the inevitable frustrations of bureaucratic complexity and mission ambiguity, Sarah had found that meaning in the daily interactions with customers who trusted her to remember their preferences and provide a reliable anchor in their routine. Marcus from Microsoft had been promoted to senior engineer and was planning his wedding to a woman he had met during the coffee shop's grand reopening celebration. Jennifer had started her own consulting business and credited the confidence she'd gained from surviving the terrorist attack with giving her courage to take entrepreneurial risks. David had discovered that his enthusiasm for seasonal drinks reflected a deeper passion for culinary arts, leading him to enroll in cooking classes that had transformed his understanding of creative expression. These were small victories, personal transformations that would never appear in intelligence reports or performance evaluations. But they represented the ultimate justification for Sarah's work, the recognition that national security was fundamentally about protecting the conditions that allowed ordinary people to pursue extraordinary dreams without fear that violence would interrupt their aspirations. Jessica had been accepted to a doctoral program at Georgetown University, where she would study the intersection of community development and national security policy. Her thesis research had evolved into a book contract that would introduce the Moonbeam Coffee model to academic and policy audiences who might adapt similar approaches for their own communities. "You've taught me that service doesn't require choosing between local and global impact," Jessica had written in the acknowledgments section of her thesis draft. "Sometimes the most effective way to change the world is to perfect your ability to serve the people right in front of you." The lesson applied beyond intelligence work. Sarah had discovered that her skills as a barista, attention to detail, pattern recognition, customer service were directly transferable to her intelligence responsibilities. The patience required to steam milk properly translated into the discipline needed for long-term surveillance. The ability to remember customer preferences became a framework for cataloging behavioral patterns that might indicate security threats, but the reverse was equally true. Her intelligence training had made her a better barista, more attuned to customer needs and community dynamics. She could read stress in facial expressions, identify relationship problems through conversation patterns, and provide emotional support. With the same analytical precision that had once guided her diplomatic communications, on quiet afternoons, when the lunch rush had ended and the shop filled with freelancers and students, Sarah sometimes reflected on the journey that had brought her from Syrian battlefields to Seattle coffee service. The path had been neither straight nor predictable, marked by losses that still woke her in the middle of the night and victories that had saved lives she would never know about. Rebecca Martinez and the other murdered colleagues had been avenged, but their deaths remained a permanent reminder that the work carried costs that couldn't be calculated in budget reports or personnel evaluations. David Chun's expertise in Chinese intelligence networks was irreplaceable. Angela Thompson's assets inside the Syrian government had taken years to develop. Marcus Sullivan's logistics capabilities had enabled operations across 3 continents. Their sacrifice had prevented Qassem's chemical weapons attack and eliminated a terrorist network that might have killed thousands of innocent people. But it had also demonstrated that the price of freedom was always paid by individuals who chose service over safety, community over comfort, and truth over the convenient lies that allowed most people to sleep peacefully. Sarah Bennett had made that choice repeatedly, first as a diplomatic communications specialist, then as a civilian seeking refuge from the moral complexities of government service, and finally as someone who integrated both identities into something new and sustainable. She had learned that the most important battles were often fought not by armies or intelligence agencies, but by ordinary people who refused to accept that evil was inevitable, or that good people were powerless to make a difference. The coffee shop clock showed 5:30 p.m., 30 minutes until closing time. Mrs. Patterson was finishing her daily crossword puzzle while sipping chamomile tea that had grown cold during her concentration. A few students occupied the corner tables, their laptops displaying homework, assignments and research projects that would shape their understanding of how the world worked and what their own responsibilities might be. Sarah cleaned the espresso machine and began preparing for the next day's service, her movements carrying the same precision that had once guided encrypted communications in hostile territory. Tomorrow would bring new customers and familiar faces, routine orders and unexpected conversations, the daily rhythm of community service that had become her calling and her cover. In her apartment that night, Sarah sat at the kitchen table writing her weekly report to federal analysts who would never know her real name or visit the coffee shop that served as their intelligence asset. The report documented casual conversations that might indicate foreign surveillance, unusual behavior patterns that could suggest security threats, and community concerns that might require federal attention. But she also included observations that wouldn't appear in official summaries. Marcus's excitement about his wedding plans, Jennifer's success with her new business, David's culinary education progress. These details didn't contribute to national security assessments, but they reminded her why that security mattered and what it was designed to protect. The work would continue tomorrow and next week and next year, one cup of coffee at a time, one conversation at a time, one act of service at a time. Sarah Bennett had found her place in the long tradition of Americans who served their country by serving their communities, who protected freedom by practicing it daily, and who proved that the most ordinary acts could have extraordinary consequences when performed with courage and commitment. She was just serving coffee, but coffee was never just coffee when it was served by someone who understood that every customer was a citizen, every conversation was an opportunity, and every day was a chance to make the world a little safer and a little better for people who would never know her true name or understand the full scope of her service. That was enough. That was everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.